Chapter 5, Part 1 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 5, Part 1. The Filipino People Before the Arrival of the Spaniards. On the arrival of the Spaniards, the population of the Philippines seems to have been distributed by tribes in much the same manner as at present. Then, as now, the Bisayas occupied the central islands of the archipelago and some of the northern coast of Mindanao. The Bicols, Tagalogs, and Pampangos were in the same parts of Luzon as we find them today. The Ilocanos occupied the coastal plain facing the China Sea. But since the arrival of the Spaniards they have now expanded considerably, and their settlements are now numerous in Pangasinan, Nueva Vizcaya, and the valley of Cagayan. These tribes, which today number nearly 7,000,000 souls, at the time of Magellan's discovery aggregated not more than 500,000. An early enumeration of the population made by the Spaniards in 1591, which included practically all of these tribes, gave a population of less than 700,000. There are other facts too that show us how sparse the population must have been. The Spanish expeditions found many coasts and islands in the Bisayan group without inhabitants. Occasionally a sailor or a canoe would be seen, and then these would disappear in some small estero or mangrove swamp, and the land seem as unpopulated as before. At certain points, like Limasaua, Butuan, and Bohol, the natives were more numerous, and Cebu was a large and thriving community. But the Spaniards had nearly everywhere to search for settled places and cultivated lands. The sparseness of the population is also well indicated by the scarcity of food. The Spaniards had much difficulty in securing sufficient provisions. A small amount of rice, a pig, and a few chickens were obtainable here and there, but the Filipinos had no large supplies. After the settlement of Manila was made, a large part of the food of the city was drawn from China. The very ease with which the Spaniards marched where they willed and reduced the Filipinos to obedience shows that the latter were weak in numbers. Laguna de Bay and the Camarines were among the most populous portions of the archipelago. All of these things and others show that the Filipinos were but a small fraction of their present number. On the other hand, the Negritos seems to have been more numerous, or at least more in evidence. They were immediately noticed on the island of Negros, where at the present they are few and confined to the interior, and in the vicinity of Manila and in Batangas, where they are no longer found, they were mingling with the Tagalog population. The culture of the various tribes, which is now quite the same throughout the archipelago, presented some differences. In the southern Bisayas, where the Spaniards first entered the archipelago, there seem to have been two kinds of natives. The hill dwellers, who lived in the interior of the islands in small numbers, who wore garments of tree bark, and who sometimes built their houses in the trees; and the sea dwellers, who were very much like the present-day Moro tribes south of Mindanao, who are known as the Samal, and who built their villages over the sea or on the shore and lived much in boats. These were probably later arrivals than the forest people. From both of these elements the Bisaya Filipinos are descended, but while the coast people have been entirely absorbed, some of the hill folk are still pagan and uncivilized, and must be very much as they were when the Spaniards first came. The highest grade of culture was in the settlements where there was regular trade with Borneo, Siam, and China, and especially about Manila, where many Mohammedan Malays had colonized. With the exception of the Negrito, all the languages of the Philippines belong to one great family, which has been called the Malayo-Polynesian. All are believed to be derived from one very ancient mother tongue. It is astonishing how widely these Malayo-Polynesian tongues have spread. Farthest east in the Pacific are the Polynesian languages. then those of the small islands known as Micronesia, then Melanesian or Papuan, the Malayan throughout the East Indian archipelago, and to the north the languages of the Philippines. But this is not all, for far westward on the coast of Africa is the island of Madagascar, many of whose languages have no connection with African, but belong to the Malayo-Polynesian family. It should be a matter of great interest to Filipinos that the great scientist, Baron William von Humboldt, considered the Tagalog to be the richest and most perfect of all the languages of the Malayo-Polynesian family, and perhaps the type of them all. It possesses, he said, all the forms collectively of which particular ones are found singly in other dialects, and it has preserved them all with very trifling exceptions unbroken, and in entire harmony and symmetry. The Spanish friars, on their arrival in the Philippines, devoted themselves at once to learning the native dialects and to the preparation of prayers and catechisms in these native tongues. They were very successful in their studies. Father Chirino tells us of one Jesuit who learned sufficient Tagalog in 70 days to preach and hear confession. In this way the Bisayan, the Tagalog, and the Ilocano were soon mastered. In the light of the opinion of von Humboldt, it is interesting to find these early Spaniards pronouncing the Tagalog the most difficult and the most admirable. Of all of them, says Padre Chirino, the one which most pleased me and filled me with admiration was the Tagalog, because, as I said to the first archbishop and afterwards to other serious persons, both there and here, I found in it 4 qualities of the 4 best languages of the world, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Spanish, and of Hebrew the mysteries and obscurities, of the Greek the articles and the precision not only of the appellative but also of the proper nouns, of the Latin the wealth and elegance, and of the Spanish the good breeding, politeness, and courtesy. The Malayan languages contain a considerable proportion of words borrowed from the Sanskrit, and in this the Tagalog, Bisayan, and Ilocano are included. Whether these words were passed along from one Malayan group to another, or whether they were introduced by the actual presence and power of the Hindu in this archipelago, may be fair ground for debate, but the case for the latter position has been so well and brilliantly put by Dr. Pardo de Tavera that his conclusions are here given in his own words. The words which Tagalog borrowed, he says, are those which signify intellectual acts, moral conceptions, emotions, superstitions, names of deities, of planets, of numerals of high number, of botany, of war and its results and consequences, and finally of titles and dignities, some animals, instruments of industry, and the names of money. From the evidence of these words, Dr. Pardo argues for a period in the early history of the Filipinos, not merely of commercial intercourse like that of the Chinese, but of Hindu political and social domination. I do not believe, he says, and I base my opinion on the same words that I have brought together in this vocabulary, that the Hindus were here simply as merchants, but that they dominated different parts of the archipelago, where today are spoken the most cultured languages, the Tagalog, the Visayan, the Pampanga, and the Ilocano, and that the higher culture of these languages comes precisely from the influence of the Hindu race over the Filipino. It is impossible to believe that the Hindus, if they came only as merchants, however great their number, would have impressed themselves in such a way as to give to these islanders the number and the kind of words which they did give. These names of dignitaries, of caciques, of high functionaries of the court, of noble ladies, indicate that all of these high positions, with names of Sanskrit origin, were occupied at one time by men who spoke that language. The words of a similar origin for objects of war, fortresses, and battle songs, for designating objects of religious belief, for superstitions, emotions, feelings, industrial and farming activities, show us clearly that the warfare, religion, literature, industry, and agriculture were at one time in the hands of the Hindus, and that this race was effectively dominant in the Philippines. When the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, the Filipinos were using systems of writing borrowed from Hindu or Javanese sources. They have learned from us to write running the lines from the left hand to the right, but formerly they only wrote from above downwards, placing the first line, if I remember rightly, at the left hand and continuing with the others to the right and opposite of the Chinese and Japanese. They write upon canes or on leaves of a palm, using for a pen a point of iron. Nowadays, in writing not only their own but also our letters, they use a quill very well cut and paper like ourselves. They have learned our language and pronunciation, and write as well as we do, and even better, for they are so bright that they learn everything with the greatest of ease. I have brought with me handwriting with very good and correct lettering. In Tigbawan I had in school a very small child who in 3 months' time learned, by copying from well-written letters that I sent him, to write enough better than I, and transcribed for me writings of importance very faithfully and without errors or mistakes. Besides the Tagalogs, the Bisayas, Pampangos, Pangasinans, and Ilocanos had alphabets, or more properly syllabaries, similar to this one. Dr. Pardo de Tavera has gathered many data concerning them, and shows that they were undoubtedly received by the Filipinos from a Sanskrit source. The Filipinos used this writing for setting down their poems and songs, which were their only literature. None of this, however, has come down to us, and the Filipinos soon adopted the Spanish alphabet, forming the syllables necessary to write their language from these letters. As all these have phonetic values, it is still very easy for a Filipino to learn to pronounce and so read his own tongue. These old characters lingered for a couple of centuries in certain places. Padre Totanes tells us that it was rare in 1705 to find a person who could use them, but the Tagbanwas, a pagan people on the island of Palawan, use a similar syllabary to this day. Besides poems, they had songs which they sang as they rowed their canoes, as they pounded the rice from its husk, and as they gathered for feast or entertainment, and especially there were songs for the dead. In these songs, says Girino, they recounted the deeds of their ancestors or of their deities. End of chapter 5, part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows, Chapter 5, Part 2. The Filipino People Before the Arrival of the Spaniards. Chinese in the Philippines. Very different from the Hindu was the early influence of the Chinese. There is no evidence that, previous to the Spanish conquest, the Chinese settled or colonized in these islands at all, and yet, 300 years before the arrival of Magellan, their trading fleets were coming here regularly, and several of the islands were well known to them. One evidence of this prehistoric trade is in the ancient Chinese jars and pottery which have been exhumed in the vicinity of Manila, but the Chinese writings themselves furnish us even better proof. About the beginning of the 13th century, though not earlier than 1205, a Chinese author named Chao Jukua wrote a work upon the maritime commerce of the Chinese people, One chapter of his work is devoted to the Philippines, which he calls the country of Malay. According to this record, it is indicated that the Chinese were familiar with the islands of the archipelago several hundred years ago. The country of Malay, says this interesting classic, "is situated to the north of Poni, that is, Brunei or Borneo. About 1,000 families inhabit the banks of a very winding stream. The natives clothe themselves in sheets of cloth resembling bed sheets, or cover their bodies with sarongs. The sarong is a gay-colored typical garment of the Malay. Scattered through the extensive forests are copper Buddha images, but no one knows how they got there. When the merchant or Chinese ships arrive at this port, they anchor in front of an open place which serves as a market, where they trade in the produce of the country. When a ship enters this port, the captain makes presents of white umbrellas to the mandarins. The merchants are obliged to pay this tribute in order to obtain the goodwill of these lords." The products of the country are stated to be yellow wax, cotton, pearls, shells, betel nuts, and yuta cloth, which was perhaps one of the several cloths still woven of abaca or piña. The articles imported by the Chinese were "porcelain, trade gold, objects of lead, glass beads of all colors, iron cooking pans, and iron needles." Very curious is the accurate mention in this Chinese writing of the negritos, the first of all accounts to be made of the little blacks. "In the interior of the valleys lives a race called Haitan. They are of low stature, have round eyes of a yellow color, curly hair, and their teeth are easily seen between their lips, that is, probably not darkened by betel chewing or artificial stains. They build their nests in the tree tops, and in each nest lives a family which consists of from 3 to 5 persons. They travel about in the densest thickets of the forest, and, without being seen themselves, shoot their arrows at the passer-by. For this reason they are much feared. If the Chinese trader throws them a small porcelain bowl, they will stoop down to catch it, and then run away with it, shouting joyfully." These junks also visited the more central islands, but here traffic was conducted on the ships, the Chinese on arrival announcing themselves by beating gongs, and the Filipinos coming out to them in their light boats. Among other things here offered by the natives for trade are mentioned "strange cloth," perhaps sename or jusi, and fine mats. This Chinese trade continued probably quite steadily until the arrival of the Spaniards. Then it received an enormous increase through the demand for Chinese food products and wares made by the Spaniards, and because of the value of the Mexican silver which the Spaniards offered in exchange. The spread of Mohammedanism, and especially the foundation of the colony of Borneo, brought the Philippines into important commercial relations with the Malays of the south. Previous to the arrival of the Spaniards, these relations seem to have been friendly and peaceful. The Mohammedan Malays sent their praus northward for purposes of trade, and they were settling in the North Philippines as they had on Mindanao. When Legazpi's fleet, soon after its arrival, lay near the island of Bohol, the Maestro de Campo had a hard fight with a Moro vessel which had come up for trade, and took 6 prisoners. One of them, whom they call the pilot, was closely interrogated by the adelantado, and some interesting information obtained, which is recorded by Padre San Agustin. Legazpi had a Malay slave interpreter with him, and San Agustin says that Padre Urdaneta "knew well the Malayan language." The pilot said that "those of Borneo brought for trade with the Filipinos copper and tin, which was brought to Borneo from China, porcelain dishes and bells made in their fashion, very different from those that the Christians use, and benzoin, and colored blankets from India, and cooking pans made in China. and that they also brought iron lances very well tempered, and knives and other articles of barter, and that in exchange for them they took away from the islands gold, slaves, wax, and a kind of small sea shell which they call sihuyes, and which passes for money in the kingdom of Siam and other places, and also they carry off some white cloths, of which there is a great quantity in the islands." Butuan, on the north coast of Mindanao, seems to have been quite a trading place resorted to by vessels from all quarters. This country, like many other parts of the Philippines, has produced from time immemorial small quantities of gold, and all the early voyagers speak of the gold earrings and ornaments of the natives. Butuan also produced sugar cane, and was a trading port for slaves. This unfortunate traffic in human life seems to have been not unusual, but was doubtless stimulated by the commerce with Borneo. Junks from Siam trading with Cebu were also encountered by the Spaniards. This intercourse and traffic had acquainted the Filipinos with many of the accessories of civilized life long before the arrival of the Spaniards. Their chiefs and datos dressed in silks and maintained some splendor of surroundings. Nearly the whole population of the tribes of the coast wrote and communicated by means of syllabary. Vessels from Luzon traded as far south as Mindanao and Borneo, although the products of Asia proper came through the fleets of foreigners. And perhaps what indicates more clearly than anything else the advance the Filipinos were making through their communication with outside people is their use of firearms. Of this point there is no question. Everywhere in the vicinity of Manila, on Lubang, in Pampanga, at Cainta, and Laguna de Bay, the Spaniards encountered forts mounting small cannon or lantakas. The Filipinos seem to have understood, moreover, the arts of casting cannon and of making powder. The first gun factory established by the Spaniards was in charge of a Filipino from Pampanga. The weakest side of the culture of the early Filipinos was their political and social organization, and they were weak here in precisely the same way that the now uncivilized peoples of northern Luzon are still weak. Their state did not embrace the whole tribe or nation, it included simply the community. Outside of the settlers in one immediate vicinity, all others were enemies, or at most foreigners. There were in the Philippines no large states, nor even great rajas and sultans such as were found in the Malay archipelago, but instead on every island were a multitude of small communities, each independent of the other and frequently waging war. The unit of their political order was a little cluster of houses from 30 to 100 families called a barangay, and which still exists in the Philippines as the barrio. At the head of each barangay was a chief known as the dato, a word no longer used in the northern Philippines, though it persists among the Moros of Mindanao. The powers of these datos within their small areas appear to have been great, and they were treated with utmost respect by the people. The barangays were grouped together in tiny federations including about as much territory as the present towns, whose affairs were conducted by the chiefs or datos, although sometimes they seem to have all been in obedience to a single chief, known in some places as the hari, at other times by the Hindu word raja, or the Mohammedan term sultan. Sometimes the power of one of these rajas seems to have extended over the whole of the small island, but usually their kingdoms embraced only a few miles. The Spaniards, in enforcing their authority through the islands, took away the real power from the datos, grouping the barangays into towns or pueblos, but making the datos cabezas de barrio, or gobernadorcillos. Something of the old distinction between the dato or principal and the common man may be still represented in the gente ilustrada, or the more wealthy, educated, and influential class found in each town, and the gente baja, or the poor and uneducated. Beneath the datos, according to Chirino and Morga, were the three classes of Filipinos: the free persons or maharlika, who paid no tribute to the dato, but who accompanied him to war, rowed his boat when he went on a journey, and attended him in his house. This class is called by Morga timauas. Then there was a very large class, who appear to have been freedmen or liberated slaves, who had acquired their own homes and lived with their families, but who owed the dato or maharlika heavy debts of service, to sow and harvest in his rice fields, to tend his fish traps, to row his canoe, to build his house, to attend him when he had guests, and to perform any other duties that the chief might command. These semi-free were called alaping namamahay, and their condition of bondage descended to their children. Beneath these existed a class of slaves. These were the sigigi liris, and they were numerous. Their slavery arose in several ways. Some were those who, as children, had been captured in war and their lives spared. Some became slaves by selling their freedom in times of hunger, but most of them became slaves through debt, which descended from father to son. The sum of 5 or 6 pesos was enough in some cases to deprive a man of his freedom. These slaves were absolutely owned by their lord, who could theoretically sell them like cattle, but, in spite of its bad possibilities, this Filipino slavery was ordinarily not of a cruel or distressing nature. The slaves frequently associated on kindly relations with their masters and were not overworked. This form of slavery still persists in the Philippines among the Moros of Mindanao and Jolo. Children of slaves inherited their parents' slavery. If one parent was free and the other slave, the first, third, and fifth children were free and the second, fourth, and sixth slaves. This whole matter of inheritance of slavery was curiously worked out in minute details. Community feeling was very strong within the barangay. A man could not leave his own barangay for life in another without the consent of the community and the payment of money. If a man of one barrio married a woman of another, their children were divided between 2 barangays. The barangay was responsible for the good conduct of its members, and if one of them suffered an injury from a man outside, the whole barangay had to be appeased. Disputes and wrongs between members of the same barangay were referred to a number of old men, who decided the matter in accordance with the customs of the tribe, which were handed down by tradition. The Filipinos, on the arrival of the Spaniards, were fetish worshippers, but they had one spirit whom they believed was the greatest of all and the creator or maker of things. The Tagalog called this deity Bathala, the Bisaya Laon, and the Ilocano Kabunian. They also worshipped the spirits of their ancestors, which were represented by small images called anitos. Fetishes, which are any objects believed to possess miraculous power, were common among the people, and idols or images were worshipped. Pigafetta describes some idols which he saw in Cebu, and Chirino tells us that, within the memory of Filipinos whom he knew, they had idols of stone, wood, bone, or the tooth of a crocodile, and that there were some of gold. They also reverenced animals and birds, especially the crocodile, the raven, and a mythical bird of blue or yellow color, which was called by the name of their deity Bathala. They had no temples or public places of worship, but each one had his anitos in his own house and performed his sacrifices and acts of worship there. As sacrifices, they killed pigs or chickens and made such occasions times of feasting, songs, and drunkenness. The life of the Filipino was undoubtedly filled with superstitious fears and imaginings. The Mohammedans outside of southern Mindanao and Jolo had settled in the vicinity of Manila Bay on the Mindoro, Lubang, and adjacent coasts of the Luzon. The spread of Mohammedanism was stopped by the Spaniards, although it is narrated that for a long time many of those living on the shores of Manila Bay refused to eat pork, which is forbidden by the Koran, and practiced the rite of circumcision. As late as 1583, Bishop Salazar, in writing to the King of Affairs in the Philippines, says the Moros had preached the law of Mohammed to great numbers in these islands, and by this preaching many of the Gentiles had become Mohammedans, and further he adds, "Those who have received this foul law guard it with much persistence, and there is great difficulty in making them abandon it, and with cause too, for the reasons they give, to our shame and confusion, are that they were better treated by the preachers of Mohammed than they have been treated by the preachers of Christ." The material surroundings of the Filipino before the arrival of the Spaniards were in nearly every way quite as they are today. The center of population of each town today, with its great church, tribunal, stores, and houses of stone and wood, is certainly in marked contrast, but the appearance of a barrio a little distance from the center is today probably much as it was then. Then, as now, the bulk of the people lived in humble houses of bamboo and nipa raised on poles above the dampness of the soil. Then, as now, the food was largely rice and the excellent fish which abound in river and sea. There were on the water the same familiar bancas and fish corrals, and on land the rice fields and coconut groves. The Filipinos had then most of the present domesticated animals, dogs, cats, goats, chickens, and pigs, and perhaps in Luzon the domesticated buffalo, although this animal was widely introduced into the Philippines from China after the Spanish conquest. Horses came with the Spaniards, and their numbers were increased by the bringing in of Chinese mares, whose importation is frequently mentioned. The Spaniards introduced also the cultivation of tobacco, coffee, and cocoa, and perhaps also the native corn of America, the maize, although Pigafetta says they found it already growing in the Bisayas. The Filipino has been affected by these centuries of Spanish sovereignty far less on his material side than he has on the spiritual, and it is mainly in the deepening and elevating of his emotional and mental life, and not in the bettering of his material condition, that advance has been made. End of chapter 5.
Of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 6. The Spanish Soldier and the Spanish Missionary. History of the Philippines as a part of the history of the Spanish colonies. We have already seen how the Philippines were discovered by Magellan in his search for the Spice Islands. Brilliant and romantic as is the story of that voyage, it brought no immediate reward to Spain. Portugal remained in her enjoyment of the Eastern trade, and nearly half a century elapsed before Spain obtained a settlement in these islands. But if for a time he neglected the Far East, the Spaniard from the peninsula threw himself with almost incredible energy and devotion into the material and spiritual conquest of America. All the greatest achievements of the Spanish soldier and the Spanish missionary had been secured within 50 years from the day when Columbus sighted the West Indies. In order to understand the history of the Philippines, we must not forget that these islands formed a part of this great colonial empire and were under the same administration, that for over 2 centuries the Philippines were reached through Mexico and to a great extent influenced by Mexico, that the same governors, judges, and soldiers held office in both hemispheres, passing from America to the Philippines and being promoted from the islands to the higher official positions of Mexico and Peru. So to understand the rule of Spain in the Philippines, we must study the great administrative machinery and the great body of laws which were developed for the government of the Indies. Character of the Spanish explorers. The conquests themselves were largely effected through the enterprise and wealth of private individuals, but these men held commissions from the Spanish crown, their actions were subject to strict royal control, and a large proportion of the profits and plunder of their expeditions were paid to the royal treasury. Upon some of these conquerors the crown bestowed the proud title of adelantado. The Spanish nobility threw themselves into these hazardous undertakings with the courage and fixed determination born of their long struggle with the Moors. Out of the soul-trying circumstances of Western conquest many obscure men rose, through their brilliant qualities of spirit, to positions of eminence and power. But the exalted offices of viceroy and governor were reserved for the titled favorites of the king. The Royal Audiencia. Very early the Spanish court, in order to protect its own authority, found it necessary to succeed the ambitious and adventurous conqueror by a ruler in close relationship with and absolute dependence on the royal will. Thus in Mexico, Cortes, the conqueror, was removed and replaced by the viceroy Mendoza, who established upon the conquests of the former the great Spanish colony of New Spain, to this day the most successful of all the states planted by Spain in America. To limit the power of the governor or viceroy, as well as to act as a supreme court for the settlement of actions and legal questions, was created the Royal Audiencia. This was a body of men of noble rank and learned in the law, sent out from Spain to form in each country a colonial court. But its powers were not alone judicial, they were also administrative. In the absence of the governor, the Audiencia assumed his duties. Treatment of the natives by the Spanish. In his treatment of the natives, whose lands he captured, the Spanish king attempted three things. First, to secure to the colonist and to the crown the advantages of their labor. Second, to convert the Indians to the Christian religion as maintained by the Roman Catholic Church. And third, to protect them from cruelty and inhumanity. Edict after edict, law after law, issued from the Spanish throne with these ends in view. As they stand upon the greatest of colonial law books, the Recopilación de Leyes de las Indias, they display an admirable sensitiveness to the needs of the Indian and an appreciation of the dangers to which he was subjected, but in the actual practice these beneficent provisions were largely useless. The first and third of Spain's purposes in her treatment of the native proved incompatible. History has shown that liberty and enlightenment cannot be taken from a race with one hand and protection given it with the other. All classes of Spain's colonial government were frankly in pursuit of wealth. Greed filled them all, and was the mainspring of every discovery and every settlement. The king wanted revenue for his treasury, the noble and the soldier booty for their private purse, the friar wealth for his order, the bishop power for his church. All this wealth had to come out of the native toiler on the lands which the Spanish conqueror had seized. And while noble motives were probably never absent and at certain times prevailed, yet in the main the native of America and of the Philippines was a sufferer under the hand and power of the Spaniard. The encomenderos. Spain's system of controlling the lives and the labor of the Indians was based to a certain extent on the feudal system, still surviving in the peninsula at the time of her colonial conquests. The captains and soldiers and priests of her successful conquests had assigned to them great estates or fruitful lands with their native inhabitants, which they managed and ruled for their own profit. Such estates were called first repartimientos, but very soon it became the practice in America to grant large numbers of Indians to the service of a Spaniard, who had over them the power of a master and who enjoyed the profits of their labor. In return, he was supposed to provide for the conversion of the Indians and their religious instruction. Such a grant of Indians was called an encomienda. The encomendero was not absolute lord of the lives and properties of the Indians, for elaborate laws were framed for the latter's protection. Yet the granting of subjects without the land on which they lived made possible their transfer and sale from one encomendero to another, and in this way thousands of Indians of America were made practically slaves and were forced into labor in the mines. As we have already seen, the whole system was attacked by the Dominican priest Las Casas, a truly noble character in the history of American colonization, and various efforts were made in America to limit the encomiendas and to prevent their introduction into Mexico and Peru. But the great power of the encomendero in America, together with the influence of the Church, which held extensive encomiendas, had been sufficient to extend the institution even against Las Casas' impassioned remonstrances. Its abolition in Mexico was decreed in 1544, but commissioners representing the municipality of Mexico and the religious orders were sent to Spain to ask the king to revoke at least those parts of the new laws which threatened the interests of the settlers. By a royal decree of October 20th, 1545, the desired revocation was granted. This action filled the Spanish settlers with joy and the enslaved Indians with despair. Thus was the institution early established as a part of the colonial system and came with the conquerors to the Philippines. Restrictions on colonization and commerce. For the management of all colonial affairs, the king created a great board or bureau, known as the Council of the Indies, which sat in Madrid and whose members were among the highest officials of Spain. The Spanish government exercised the closest supervision over all colonial matters, and colonization was never free. All persons, wares, and ships passing from Spain to any of her colonial possessions were obliged to pass through Seville and this one port alone. This wealthy ancient city, situated on the river Guadalquivir in southwestern Spain, was the gateway to the Spanish Empire. From this port went forth the mailed soldier, the robed friar, the adventurous noble, and the brave and high-born Spanish ladies who accompanied their husbands to such great distances over the sea. And back to this port were brought the gold of Peru, the silver of Mexico, and the silks and embroideries of China, dispatched through the Philippines. It must be observed that all intercourse between Spain and her colonies were rigidly controlled by the government. Spain sought to create and maintain an exclusive monopoly of her colonial trade. To enforce and direct this monopoly, there was at Seville the commercial house, or Casa de Contratación. No one could sail from Spain to a colonial possession without a permit and after government registration. No one could send out goods or import them except through the commercial house and upon the payment of extraordinary imposts. Trade was absolutely forbidden to any except Spaniards, and by her forts and fleets Spain strove to isolate her colonies from the approach of Portuguese, Dutch, or English, whose ships, no less daringly manned than those of Spain herself, were beginning to traverse the seas in search of the plunder and spoils of foreign conquest and trade. Summary of the colonial policy of Spain. Spain sought foreign colonies, first, for the spoils of accumulated wealth that could be seized and carried away at once, and secondly, for the income that could be procured through the labor of the inhabitants of the lands she gained. In framing her government and administration of her colonies, she sought primarily the political enlightenment and welfare neither of the Spanish colonists nor the native race, but the glory, power, and patronage of the crown. The commercial and trade regulations were devised, not to develop the resources and increase the prosperity of the colonies, but to add wealth to the peninsula. Yet the purposes of Spain were far from being wholly selfish. With zeal and success, she sought the conversion of the heathen natives, whom she subjected, and in this showed a humanitarian interest in advance of the Dutch and English, who rivaled her in colonial empire. The colonial ideals under which the policy of Spain was framed were those of the times. In the centuries that have succeeded, public wisdom and conscience on these matters have immeasurably improved. Nations no longer make conquests frankly to exploit them, but the public opinion of the world demands that the welfare of the colonial subject be sought and that he be protected from official greed. There is great advance still to be made. It can hardly be said that the world yet recognizes that a stronger people should assist a weaker without assurance of material reward, but this is the direction in which the most enlightened feeling is advancing. Every undertaking of the white race, which has such aims in view, is an experiment worthy of profound interest and solicitous sympathy. Result of the voyage of Magellan and Elcano. The mind of the Spanish adventurer was greatly excited by the results of Sebastian Elcano's voyage. Here was the opportunity for rich trade and great profit. Numerous plans were laid before the king, one of them for the building of an Indian trading fleet and an annual voyage to the Moluccas to gather a great harvest of spices. Portugal protested against this move until the question of her claim to the Moluccas, under the division of Pope Alexander, could be settled. The exact longitude of Ternate west from the line 370 leagues beyond the Verde Islands, was not well known. Spaniards argued that it was less than 180 degrees, and therefore, in spite of Portugal's earlier discovery, belonged to them. The pilot Medina, for example, explained to Charles V that from the meridian 370 degrees west of San Anton, the most westerly island of the Verde group, to the city of Mexico was 59 degrees, from Mexico to Navidad 9 degrees, and from this port to Cebu 100 degrees. A total of only 168 degrees, leaving a margin of 12 degrees. Therefore, by the final treaty, the Indies, Moluccas, Borneo, Gilolo, and the Philippines were Spain's. A great council of ambassadors and cosmographers was held at Badajoz in 1524, but reached no agreement. Spain announced her resolution to occupy the Moluccas, and Portugal threatened with death the Spanish adventurers who should be found there. The first expedition to the Philippines. Spain acted immediately upon her determination, and in 1525 dispatched an expedition under Jofre de Loaisa to reap the fruits of Magellan's discoveries. The captain of one vessel was Sebastian Elcano, who completed the voyage of Magellan. On his ship sailed Andres de Urdaneta, who later became an Augustinian friar and accompanied the expedition of Legazpi that finally effected the settlement of the Philippines. Not without great hardship and losses did the fleet pass the Straits of Magellan and enter the Pacific Ocean. In mid-ocean, Loaisa died, and 4 days later the famous Sebastian Elcano. Following a route somewhat similar to that of Magellan, the fleet reached first the Ladrone Islands and later the coast of Mindanao. From here they attempted to sail to Cebu, but the strong northeast monsoon drove them southward to the Moluccas, and they landed on Tidor the last day of the year 1526. The failure of the expedition. The Portuguese were at this moment fighting to reduce the native rajas of these islands to subjection. They regarded the Spaniards as enemies, and each party of Europeans was shortly engaged in fighting and in inciting the natives against the other. The condition of the Spaniards became desperate in the extreme, and indicates at what cost of life the conquests of the 16th century were made. Their ships had become so battered by storm as to be no longer seaworthy. The 2 officers who had successively followed Loaisa and Elcano in command had likewise perished. Of the 450 men who had sailed from Spain, but 120 now survived. These, under the leadership of Hernando de la Torre, threw up a fort on the island of Tidor, unable to go farther or to retire, and awaited hoped-for succor from Spain. Relief came, not from the peninsula, but from Mexico. Under the instructions of the Spanish king, in October 1527, Cortes dispatched from Mexico a small expedition in charge of D. Alvaro de Saavedra. Swept rapidly by the equatorial trades, in a few months Saavedra had traversed the Carolines, reprovisioned on Mindanao, and reached its survivors on Tidor. Twice they attempted to return to New Spain, but strong trade winds blow without cessation, north and south on either side of the equator for the space of more than 1,200 miles, and the northern latitude of calms and prevailing westerly winds were not yet known. Twice Saavedra beat his way eastward among the strange islands of Papua and Melanesia, only to be at last driven back upon Tidor and there to die. The survivors were forced to abandon the Moluccas. By surrendering to the Portuguese, they were assisted to return to Europe by way of Malacca, Ceylon, and Africa, and they arrived at Lisbon in 1536, the survivors of Loaisa's expedition having been gone from Spain 11 years. The efforts of the Spanish crown to obtain possession of the Spice Islands, the Moluccas and Celebes, with their coveted products of nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper, were for the time suspended. By the Treaty of Zaragoza, 1529, the Emperor Charles V, for the sum of 350,000 gold ducats, mortgaged his claim to the Moluccas. For 13 years the provisions of this treaty were respected by the Spaniards, and then another attempt was made to obtain a foothold in the East Indies. The second expedition to the Philippines. The facts that disaster had overwhelmed so many, that the 2 oceans must be crossed, and that no sailing route from Asia back to America was known, did not deter the Spaniards from their perilous conquests. and in 1542 another expedition sailed from Mexico under command of Lopez de Villalobos to explore the Philippines and, if possible, to reach China. Across the Pacific they made a safe and pleasant voyage. In the warm waters of the Pacific they sailed among those wonderful coral atolls, rings of low shore decked with palms, grouped in beautiful archipelagos, whose appearance has never failed to delight the navigator, and whose composition is one of the most interesting subjects known to students of the earth's structure and history. Some of these many islands Villalobos took possession of in the name of Spain. These were perhaps the Pelew Islands or the Carolines. At last Villalobos reached the east coast of Mindanao, but after some deaths and sickness they sailed again and were carried south by the monsoon to the little island of Sarangani, south of the southern peninsula of Mindanao. The natives were hostile, but the Spaniards drove them from their stronghold and made some captures of musk, amber, oil, and gold dust. In need of provisions they planted the maize, or Indian corn, the wonderful cereal of America, which yields so bounteously and so soon after planting. Food was greatly needed by the Spaniards and was very difficult to obtain. The naming of the islands. Villalobos equipped a small vessel and sent it northward to try to reach Cebu. This vessel reached the coast of Samar. Villalobos gave to the island the name of Filipina, in honor of the Spanish Infante, or heir apparent, Philip, who was soon to succeed his father Charles V as King Philip II of Spain. Later, in his correspondence with the Portuguese, Villalobos speaks of the archipelago as Las Filipinas. Although for many years the title of the Islas del Poniente continued in use, Villalobos' name of Filipinas gradually gained place and has lived. The end of the expedition. While on Sarangani, demands were made by the Portuguese, who claimed that Mindanao belonged with Celebes and that the Spaniards should leave. Driven from Mindanao by lack of food and hostility of the natives, Villalobos was blown southward by storms to Gilolo. Here, after long negotiations, the Portuguese compelled him to surrender. The survivors of the expedition dispersed, some remaining in the Indies and some eventually reaching Spain, but Villalobos, overwhelmed by discouragement, died on the island of Amboyna. The priest who ministered to him in his last hours was the famous Jesuit missionary to the Indies, Saint Francis Xavier. 23 years were to elapse after the sailing of Villalobos' fleet before another Spanish expedition should reach the Philippines. The year 1565 dates the permanent occupation of the archipelago by the Spanish. Increase in political power of the Church. Under Philip II, the champion of ecclesiasticism, the Spanish crown cemented the union of the monarchy with the Church and devoted the resources of the empire not only to colonial acquisition, but to combating the Protestant Revolution on the one hand and heathenism on the other. The Spanish king effected so close a union of the Church and state in Spain that from this time on religious issues increasingly gained in importance, and profoundly influenced the policy and fate of the nation. The policy of Philip II, however, brought upon Spain the revolt of the Dutch lowlands and the wars with England, and her struggle with these two nations drained her resources both on land and sea and occasioned a physical and moral decline. But while Spain was constantly losing power and prestige in Europe, the king was extending his colonial domain, lending royal aid to the ambitious adventurer and to the ardent missionary friar. Spain's object being to Christianize as well as to conquer, the missionary became a very important figure in the history of every colonial enterprise, and these great orders to whom missions were entrusted thus became the central institutions in the history of the Philippines. The rise of monasticism. Monasticism was introduced into Europe from the East at the very commencement of the Middle Ages. The fundamental idea of the old monasticism was retirement from human society in the belief that the world was bad and could not be bettered, and that men could lead holier lives and better please God by forsaking secular employments and family relations, and devoting all their attention to purifying their characters. The first important order in Europe were the Benedictines, organized in the 6th century. Their rule and organization were the pattern for those that followed. The clergy of the church were divided thus into two groups. First, the parish priests or ministers, who lived among the people over whom they exercised the cure of souls, and who, because they were of the people themselves and lived their lives in association with the community, were known as the secular clergy. and second, the monks or regular clergy, who were so called because they lived under the rule of their order. In the early part of the 13th century, monasticism, which had waned somewhat during the preceding 2 centuries, received a new impetus and inspiration from the organization of new orders known as brethren or friars. The idea underlying their organization was noble and higher than that of the old monasticism, for it emphasized the idea of service, of ministry both to the hearts and bodies of depressed and suffering men. The Dominicans. The order of Dominicans was organized by Saint Dominic of Spain about 1215. The primary object of its members was to defend the doctrines of the Church, and by teaching and preaching, destroy the doubts and protests which in the 13th century were beginning to disturb the claims of the Catholic Church and the papacy. The Dominican friars did not live in seclusion, but traveled about, humbly clad, preaching in the villages and towns, and seeking to expose and punish the heretic. The medieval universities, through their study of philosophy and the Roman law, were producing a class of men disposed to hold opinions contrary to the teachings of the Church. The Dominicans realized the importance of these great centers of instruction and entered them as teachers and masters, and by the beginning of the 15th century had made them strongholds of conservatism and orthodoxy. The Franciscans. In the same epoch of revival, the order of Franciscans was founded by Saint Francis of Assisi in Italy. The aims of this order were not only to preach and administer the sacraments, but to nurse the sick, provide for the destitute, and alleviate the dreadful misery which affected whole classes in the Middle Ages. They took vows of absolute poverty, and so humble was the garb prescribed by their rule that they went barefooted from place to place. The Augustinian order was given organization by Pope Alexander IV in 1256, and still other orders followed. The generation of the orders. Without doubt, the early ministrations of these friars were productive of great good, both on the religious and humanitarian sides. But, as the orders became wealthy, the friars lost their spirituality and their lives grew vicious. By the beginning of the 16th century, the administration of the Church throughout Europe had become so corrupt, the economic burden of the religious orders so great, and religious teaching and belief so material that the best and noblest minds in all countries were agitating for reform. The Reformation. In addition to changes in church administration, many Christians were demanding a greater freedom of religious thinking, and radical changes in the church doctrine which had taken form in the Middle Ages. Thus, while all the best minds in the church were united in seeking reformation of character and of administration, great differences arose between them as to the possibility of change in church doctrines. These differences accordingly separated them into two parties. The papal party adhered strongly to the doctrine as it was then accepted, while various leaders in the north of Europe, including Martin Luther in Germany, Zwingli in Switzerland, and John Calvin in France and Geneva, broke with the authority of the Pope and declared for a liberation of the individual conscience. Upon the side of the papacy, the Emperor Charles V, threw the weight of the Spanish monarchy, and to enforce the papal authority he attacked the German princes by force of arms. The result was a great revolt from the Roman Catholic Church, which spread all over northern Germany, a large portion of Switzerland, the lowlands of the Rhine, and England, and which included a numerous and very influential element among the French people. These countries, with the exception of France, have remained Protestant to the present day, and the great expansion of the English people in America and the East has established Protestantism in all parts of the world. Effects of the Reformation in the Roman Catholic Church. The Reform movement, which lasted through the century, brought about a great improvement in the Roman Catholic Church. Many who remained devoted to Roman Catholic orthodoxy were zealous for administrative reform. A great assembly of churchmen, the Council of Trent, for years devoted itself to legislation to correct abuses. The Inquisition was revived and put into force against Protestants, especially in the dominions of Spain, and the religious orders were reformed and stimulated to new sacrifices and great undertakings. But greater perhaps than any of these agencies, in re-establishing the power of the Pope and reviving the life of the Roman Catholic Church, was the organization of a new order, the Society of Jesus. The founder was a Spaniard, Ignatius Loyola. The Jesuits devoted themselves especially to education and missionary activity. Their schools soon covered Europe, while their mission stations were to be found in both North and South America, India, the East Indies, China, and Japan. The Spanish missionary. The Roman Catholic Church, having lost a large part of Europe, thus strove to make up the loss by gaining converts in heathen lands. Spain, being the power most rapidly advancing her conquests abroad, was the source of the most tireless missionary effort. From the time of Columbus, every fleet that sailed to gain plunder and lands for the Spanish kingdom carried bands of friars and churchmen to convert to Christianity the heathen peoples whom the sword of the soldier should reduce to obedience. The laws of the Indies gave special power and prominence to the priest. In these early days of Spain's colonial empire, many priests were men of piety, learning, and unselfish devotion. Their efforts softened somewhat the violence and brutality that often marred the Spanish treatment of the native, and they became the civilizing agents among the peoples whom the Spanish soldiers had conquered. In Paraguay, California, and the Philippines, the power and importance of the Spanish missionary outweighed that of the soldier or governor in the settlement of those countries and the control of the native inhabitants. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7, Part 1 of A History of the Philippines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Philippines by David Barrows. Chapter 7, Part 1. Period of Conquest and Settlement, 1565 to 1600. Cause of Settlement and Conquest of the Philippines. The previous Spanish expeditions whose misfortunes have been narrated seem to have proved to the court of Spain that they could not drive the Portuguese from the Moluccas. But to the east of the Moluccas lay great unexplored archipelagos, which might lie within the Spanish demarcation, and which might yield spices and other valuable articles of trade. And as the Portuguese had made no effective occupation of the Philippines, the minds of Spanish conquerors turned to this group also as a coveted field of conquest, even though it was pretty well understood that they lay in the latitude of the Moluccas, and so were denied by treaty to Spain. In 1559, the Spanish king, Felipe II, commanded the viceroy of Mexico to undertake again the discovery of the islands lying toward the Moluccas, but the rights of Portugal to islands within her demarcation were to be respected. 5 years passed before ships and equipments could be prepared, and during these years the objects of the expedition received considerable discussion and underwent some change. The king invited Andres de Urdaneta, who years before had been a captain in the expedition of Loaisa, to accompany the expedition as a guide and director. Urdaneta, after his return from the previous expedition, had renounced military life and had become an Augustinian friar. He was known to be a man of wise judgment, with good knowledge of cosmography, and as a missionary he was able to give to the expedition that religious strength which characterized all Spanish undertakings. It was Urdaneta's plan to colonize, not the Philippines but New Guinea, but the Audiencia of Mexico, which had charge of fitting out the expedition, charged it in minute instructions to reach and if possible colonize the Philippines, to trade for spices, and to discover the return sailing route back across the Pacific to New Spain. The natives of the islands were to be converted to Christianity, and missionaries were to accompany the expedition. In the quaint language of Fray Gaspar de San Agustin, there were sent holy guides to unfurl and wave the banners of Christ, even to the remotest portions of the islands, and to drive the devil from the tyrannical possession, which he had held for so many ages, usurping to himself the adoration of those peoples. The third expedition to the Philippines. The expedition sailed from the port of Natividad, Mexico, November 21st, 1564, under the command of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. The ships followed for a part of the way a course further south than was necessary, and touched at some inhabited islands of Micronesia. About the 22nd of January they reached the Ladrones, and had some trouble with the natives. They reached the southern end of Samar about February the 13th. Possession of Samar was taken by Legazpi in the name of the king, and small parties were sent both north and south to look for villages of the Filipinos. A few days later they rounded the southern part of Samar, crossed the strait to the coast of southern Leyte, and Captain Martin de Goiti discovered the town of Cabalian, and on the 5th of March the fleet sailed to this town. Provisions were scarce on the Spanish vessels, and great difficulty was experienced in getting food from the few natives met in boats or in the small settlements discovered. Legazpi at Bohol. About the middle of March the fleet arrived at Bohol, doubtless the southern or eastern shore. While near here Goiti in a small boat captured a Moro prau from Borneo, and after a hard fight brought back the Moros as prisoners to Legazpi. There proved to be quite a trade existing between the Moros from Borneo and the natives of Bohol and Mindanao. Here on Bohol they were able to make friendly terms with the natives, and with Sikatuna, the dato of Bohol, Legazpi performed the ceremony of blood covenant. The Spanish leader and Filipino chief each made a small cut in his own arm or breast and drank the blood of the other. According to Gaspar de San Agustin, the blood was mixed with a little wine or water and drunk from a goblet. This custom was the most sacred bond of friendship among the Filipinos, and friendship so pledged was usually kept with great fidelity. Legazpi in Cebu. On the 27th of April, 1565, Legazpi's fleet reached Cebu. Here, in this beautiful strait and fine anchoring ground, Magellan's ships had lingered until the death of their leader, 44 years before. A splendid native settlement lined the shore, so Father Chirino tells us, for a distance of more than a league. The natives of Cebu were fearful and greatly agitated, and seemed determined to resist the landing of the Spaniards. But at the first discharge of the guns of the ships, the natives abandoned the shore, and setting fire to the town, retreated into the jungles and hills. Without loss of life, the Spaniards landed and occupied the harbor and town. Finding of the Holy Child of Cebu. The Spanish soldiers found in one of the houses of the natives a small wooden image of the child Jesus. A similar image, Pigafetta tells us, he himself had given to a native while in the island with Magellan. It had been preserved by the natives and was regarded by them as an object of veneration. To the pious Spaniards the discovery of this sacred object was hailed as an event of great good fortune. It was taken by the monks and carried to a shrine especially erected for it. It still rests in the church of the Augustinians, an object of great devotion. Settlement made at Cebu. In honor of this image, the settlement of the Spaniards in the Philippines later received the name of City the Most Holy Name of Jesus. Here Legazpi established a camp, and by great tact and skill, gradually won the confidence and friendship of the inhabitants. A formal peace was at last concluded in which the dato, Tupas, recognized the sovereignty of Spain, and the people of Cebu and the Spaniards bound themselves to assist each other against the enemies of either. They had some difficulty in understanding one another, but the Spaniards had with them a Mohammedan Malay of Borneo, called Sidamal, who had been taken from the East Indies to the peninsula, and thence to Mexico in Legazpi's expedition. The languages of Malaysia and the Philippines are so closely related that this man was able to interpret. Almost immediately, however, the missionaries began the study of the native dialect, and Padre Chirino tells us that Friar Martin Herrera made here the first Filipino vocabulary, and was soon preaching the gospel to the natives in their own language. Discovery of the northern return route across the Pacific. Before the arrival of the expedition in the Philippines, the captain of one of Legazpi's ships, inspired by ungenerous ambition and the hopes of getting a reward, outsailed the rest of the fleet. Having arrived first in the islands, he started at once upon the return voyage. Unlike preceding captains who had tried to return to New Spain by sailing eastward from the islands against both wind and ocean current, this captain sailed northward, beyond the trades, into the more favorable westerly winds, and found his way back to America and New Spain. Legazpi's instructions required him to dispatch at least one vessel on the return voyage to New Spain, soon after arriving in the Philippines. Accordingly, on June 1st, the San Pablo set sail, carrying about 200 men, including Urdaneta and another friar. This vessel also followed the northern route across the Pacific, and after a voyage of great hardship, occupying 3.5 months, it reached the coast of North America at California, and followed it southward to Acapulco. The discovery made by these captains of a favorable route for vessels returning from the islands to New Spain, safe from capture by the Portuguese, completed the plans of the Spanish for the occupation of the Philippines. In 1567 another vessel was dispatched by Legazpi and made this voyage successfully. The sailing of the San Pablo left Legazpi in Cebu with a colony of only 150 Spaniards, poorly provided with resources, to commence the conquest of the Philippines. But he kept the friendship and respect of the natives, and in 1566 and 1568 ships with reinforcements arrived from Mexico. While Legazpi was at Panay in 1570, there finally arrived a ship which brought instructions from the king, in reply to Legazpi's first reports, that the islands should be held and colonized. These orders appointed Legazpi adelantado and governor, and allowed the assignment of natives in encomiendas to the soldiers who had effected the conquest. The further exploration of the islands had meanwhile proceeded. The great difficulty experienced by Legazpi was to procure sufficient food for his expedition. At different times he sent a ship to the nearest islands, and twice his ship went south to Mindanao to procure a cargo of cinnamon to be sent back to New Spain. Meanwhile, a captain, Enriquez de Guzman, had discovered Masbate, Burias, and Ticao, and had landed on Luzon in the neighborhood of Albay, called then Italon. Thus month by month the Spaniards gained acquaintance with the beautiful island sea of the archipelago, with its green islands and brilliant sheets of water, its safe harbors and scattered settlements. While Legazpi's resources were weakest, he was attacked and blockaded at Cebu by a Portuguese fleet which sought to prevent the Spanish occupation. Both to strengthen his position and to secure better supplies, Legazpi moved his camp in 1569 to the island of Panay. The Basayan tribes tattooed their bodies with ornamental designs, a practice widespread throughout Oceanica, and which still is common among the tribes of northern Luzon. This practice caused the Spaniards to give to the Bisayas the title of Islas de los Pintados, the Islands of the Painted. Legazpi found that the island of Mindoro had been partially settled by Moros from the south, and many of those settlements were devoted to piracy, preying especially upon the towns on the north coast of Panay. In January 1570, Legazpi dispatched his grandson, Juan de Salcedo, to punish these marauders. Capture of pirate strongholds. Salcedo had a force of 40 Spaniards and a large number of Bisayas. He landed on the western coast of Mindoro and took the pirate town of Mamburao. The main stronghold of the Moros he found to be on the small island of Lubang, northwest of Mindoro. Here they had 3 strong forts with high walls, on which were mounted small brass cannon, or lantacas. 2 of these forts were surrounded by moats. There were several days of fighting before Lubang was conquered. The possession of Lubang brought the Spaniards almost to the entrance of Manila Bay. Conquest of the Moro city of Manila. Expedition from Panay. Reports had already come to Legazpi of an important Mohammedan settlement, named Manila, on the shore of a great bay, and a Mohammedan chieftain called Maumat was procured to guide the Spaniards on their conquest of this region. For this purpose Legazpi sent his field marshal, Martin de Goiti, with Salcedo, 120 Spanish soldiers, and 14 or 15 boats filled with Bisayan allies. They left Panay early in May, and after stopping at Mindoro, came to anchor in Manila Bay, off the mouth of the Pasig River. The Mohammedan city. On the south bank of the river was the fortified town of the Mohammedan chieftain, Raja Soliman. On the north bank was the town of Tondo, under the Raja Alcandora, or Lacandola. Morga tells us that these Mohammedan settlers from the island of Borneo had commenced to arrive on the island only a few years before the coming of the Spaniards. They had settled and married among the Filipino population already occupying Manila Bay, and had introduced some of the forms and practices of the Mohammedan religion. The city of Manila was defended by a fort apparently on the exact site of the present fort of Santiago. It was built of the trunks of palms, and had embrasures where were mounted a considerable number of cannon or lantacas. Capture of the city. The natives received the foreigners at first with a show of friendliness, but after they had landed on the banks of the Pasig, Soliman, with a large force, assaulted them. The impetuous Spaniards charged and carried the fortifications, and the natives fled, setting fire to their settlement. When the fight was over, the Spaniards found among the dead the body of a Portuguese artillerist who had directed the defense. Doubtless he was one who had deserted from the Portuguese garrisons far south in the Indian archipelago to cast in his fortunes with the Malays. It being the commencement of the season of rains and typhoons, the Spaniards decided to defer the occupation of Manila, and after exploring Cavite harbor, they returned to Panay. A year was spent in strengthening their hold on the Bisayas and in arranging for their conquest of Luzon. On Masbate were placed a friar and 6 soldiers, so small was the number that could be spared. Founding of the Spanish city of Manila. With a force of 230 men, Legazpi returned in the spring of 1571 to the conquest of Luzon. It was a bloodless victory. The Filipino rajas declared themselves vassals of the Spanish king, and in the months of May and June the Spaniards established themselves in the present site of the city. At once Legazpi gave orders for the reconstruction of the fort, the building of quarters, a convent for the Augustinian monks, a church, and 150 houses. The boundaries of this city followed closely the outlines of the Tagalog city, Manila, and it seems probable that the location of buildings then established has been adhered to until the present time. This settlement appeared so desirable to Legazpi that he at once designated it as the capital of the archipelago. Almost immediately he organized its municipal government, or ayuntamiento. The first battle on Manila Bay. In spite of their ready submission, the rajas, Soliman and Lacandola, did not yield their sovereignty without a struggle. They were able to secure assistance in the Tagalog and Pampango settlements of Macabebe and Agonoy. A great fleet of 40 war praus gathered in palm-lined estuaries on the north shore of Manila Bay and came sweeping down the shallow coast to drive the Spaniards from the island. Against them were sent Goiti and 50 men. The protective mail armor, the heavy swords and lances, the horrible firearms, coupled with the persistent courage and fierce resolution of the Spanish soldier of the 16th century, swept back this native armament. The chieftain Soliman was killed. The conquest of central Luzon. Goiti continued his marching and conquering northward until the southern end of the plain of central Luzon, that stretches from Manila Bay to the Gulf of Lingayen, lay submissive before him. A little later the Raja Lacandola died, having accepted Christian baptism, and the only powerful resistance on the island of Luzon was ended. Goiti was sent back to the Bisayas, and the command of the army of Luzon fell to Salcedo, the brilliant and daring grandson of Legazpi, at this time only 22 years of age. This young knight led his command up the Pasig River. Cainta and Taytay, at that time important Tagalog towns, were conquered, and then the country south of Laguna de Bay. The town of Cainta was fortified and defended by small cannon, and although Salcedo spent 3 days in negotiations, it was only taken by storm, in which 400 Filipino men and women perished. From here, Salcedo marched over the mountains to the Pacific coast and south into the Camarines, where he discovered the gold mines of Paracale and Mambulao. At about this time, the Spaniards discovered the Cuyos and Calamianes Islands in the northern part of Palawan. Exploration of the coast of northern Luzon. In 1572, Salcedo, with a force of only 45 men, sailed northward from Manila, landed in Zambales and Pangasinan, and on the long and rich Ilocos coast effected a permanent submission of the inhabitants. He also visited the coast farther north, where the great and fertile valley of the Cagayan, the largest river of the archipelago, reaches to the sea. From here he continued his adventurous journey down the Pacific coast of Luzon to the island of Polillo, and returned by way of Laguna de Bay to Manila. Death of Legazpi. He arrived in September 1572 to find that his grandfather and commander, Legazpi, had died a month before, August 20th, 1572. After 7 years of labor, the conqueror of difficulties was dead, but almost the entire archipelago had been added to the crown of Spain. 300 years of Spanish dominion secured little more territory than that traversed and pacified by the conquerors of these early years. In spite of their slender forces, the daring of the Spaniards induced them to follow a policy of widely extending their power, effecting settlements, and enforcing submission wherever rich coasts and the gathering of population attracted them. Within a single year's time, most of the coast country of Luzon had been traversed, important positions seized, and the inhabitants portioned out in encomiendas. On the death of Legazpi, the command fell to Guido de Labezares. Reasons for this easy conquest of the Philippines. The explanation of how so small a number of Europeans could so rapidly and successfully reduce to subjection the inhabitants of a territory like the Philippines, separated into so many islands, is to be found in several things. First, the expedition had a great leader, one of those knights combining sagacity with resolution, who glorified the brief period when Spanish prestige was highest. No policy could ever be successful in the Philippines which did not depend for its strength upon giving a measure of satisfaction to the Filipino people. Legazpi did this. He appears to have won the native datos, treating them with consideration, and holding out to them the expectations of a better and more prosperous era, which the sovereignty of the Spaniard would bring. Almost from the beginning, the natives of an island already reduced flocked to his standard to assist in the conquest of another. The small forces of the Spanish soldiers were augmented by hundreds of Filipino allies. Second, another reason is found in the wonderful courage and great fighting power of the Spanish soldier. Each man, splendidly armored and weaponed, deadly with either sword or spear, carrying in addition the arquebus, the most efficient firearm of the time, was equal in combat to many natives who might press upon him with their naked bodies and inferior weapons. Third, Legazpi was extremely fortunate in his captains, who included such old campaigners as the field marshal Martin de Goiti, who had been to the Philippines before with Villalobos, and such gallant youths as Salcedo, one of the most attractive military figures in all Spanish history. Fourth, in considering this Spanish conquest we must understand that the islands were far more sparsely inhabited than they are today. The Bisayan Islands, the rich Camarines, the island of Luzon, had in Legazpi's time only a small fraction of their present great populations. This population was not only small, but it was also extremely disunited. Not only were the great tribes separated by the differences of language, but, as we have already seen, each tiny community was practically independent, and the power of a dato very limited. There were no great princes with large forces of fighting retainers whom they could call to arms, such as the Portuguese had encountered among the Malays south in the eastern archipelago. Fifth, but certainly one of the greatest factors in the yielding of the Filipino to the Spaniard was the preaching of the missionary friars. No man is so strong with an unenlightened and barbarous race as he who claims power from God. And the preaching of the Catholic faith, with its impressive and dramatic services, its holy sacraments, its power to arrest the attention and to admit at once the rude mind into the circle of its ministry, won the heart of the Filipino. Without doubt he was ready and eager for a loftier and truer religious belief and ceremonial. There was no powerful native priesthood to oppose the introduction of Christianity. The preaching of the faith and the baptism of converts proceeded as rapidly as the missionaries could be obtained. The dangers of the Spanish occupation. Such conditions promised the success of the Spanish occupation, provided the small colony could be protected from outside attacks. But even from the beginning the position of this little band of conquerors was perilous. Their numbers were small and at times much scattered, and their only source of succor lay thousands of miles away, across the greatest body of water on the earth, in a land itself a colony newly wrested from the hand of the savage. Across the narrow waters of the China Sea, only a few days distant, even in the slow-sailing junks, lay the teeming shores of the most populous country in the world, in those days not averse to foreign conquest. Attempt of the Chinese under Limahong to capture Manila. Activity of the southern Chinese. It was from the Chinese that the first heavy blow fell. The southeastern coast of China, comprising the provinces of Kwangtung and Fukien, had always exhibited a restlessness and passion for emigration not displayed by other parts of the country. From these two provinces, through the ports of Amoy and Canton, have gone these Chinese traders and coolies to be found in every part of the East and many other countries of the world. 300 years before the arrival of the Spaniards, Chinese junks traversed the Philippine seas and visited regularly Luzon and the coast of Mindanao. Limahong's expedition to the Philippines. This coast of China has always been notorious for its piracy. The distance of the capital at Peking and the weakness of the provincial viceroys have made impossible its suppression. It was one of these bold filibusters of the China Sea, called Limahong, who 2 years after the death of Legazpi attempted the conquest of the Philippines. The stronghold of this corsair was the island of Pehon, where he fortified himself and developed his power. Here, reports of the prosperous condition of Manila reached him, and he prepared a fleet of 62 war junks, with 4,000 soldiers and sailors. The accounts even state that a large number of women and artisans were taken on board to form the nucleus of the settlement, as soon as the Spaniards should be destroyed. In the latter part of November, 1574, this powerful fleet came sweeping down the western coast of Luzon, and on the 29th gathered in the little harbor of Mariveles, at the entrance to Manila Bay. 8 miles south of Manila is the town of Parañaque, on an estuary which affords a good landing place for boats entering from the bay. Here, on the night following, Limahong put ashore 600 men under one of his generals, Sioko, who was a Japanese. The attack upon Manila. From here they marched rapidly up the beach and fell furiously upon the city. Almost their first victim was the field marshal Goiti. The fort of Manila was at this date a weak affair, without ditches or escarpment, and it was here that the struggle took place. The Spaniards, although greatly outnumbered, were able to drive back the Chinese, but they themselves lost heavily. Limahong then sent ashore heavy reinforcements and prepared to overwhelm the garrison. The Spaniards were saved from defeat by the timely arrival of Salcedo with 50 musketeers. From his station at Bigan he had seen the sails of Limahong's fleet, cruising southward along the Luzon coast, and suspecting that so great an expedition could have no other purpose than the capture of Manila, he embarked in 7 small boats and reached the city in 6 days, just in time to participate in the furious battle between the Spaniards and the entire forces of the Chinese pirate. The result was the complete defeat of the Chinese, who were driven back upon their boats. The result of Limahong's expedition. Although defeated in his attack on Manila, Limahong was yet determined on a settlement in Luzon, and sailing northward he landed in Pangasinan and began constructing fortifications at the mouth of the river Lingayen. The Spaniards did not wait for him to strengthen himself and to dispute with them afresh for the possession of the island, but organized in March an expedition of 250 Spaniards and 1,500 Filipinos under Salcedo. They landed suddenly in the Gulf of Lingayen, burned the entire fleet of the Chinese, attacked the camp of the pirates, and killed a number of them. The rest, though hemmed in by the Spaniards, were able to construct small boats in which they escaped from the islands. Thus ended this formidable attack, which threatened for a time to overthrow the power of Spain in the East. It was the beginning, however, of important relations with China. Before Limahong's escape, a junk arrived from the Viceroy of Fukien, petitioning for the delivery of the Chinese pirate. 2 Augustinian friars accompanied his junk back to China, eager for such great fields of missionary conquest. They carried letters from Labezares, inviting Chinese friendship and intercourse. End of chapter 7, part 1.